January 2024. A massive inferno erupts in the middle of the night, swallowing what remains of a brick monster. As the walls collapse into ash, it's not just debris hitting the ground. It's the final thud of a fallen dynasty. Rewind a century. You are standing before an industrial cathedral spanning 113 acres. The air smells of coal and ambition. Here, iron is tamed into precision gears, and black walnut is polished into thrones for the American parlor. By 1913, if you walked into any home from New York to Nairobi, you'd find it. A sleek, black machine with gold filigree. People didn't call it a sewing machine. They simply called it a singer. This was the company that taught the world how to spend money they hadn't earned yet, pioneering the first installment plans. They owned vast forests in Canada, private fleets on the Atlantic, and a global monopoly so absolute it would make Apple or Google blush. Singer wasn't just a corporation, it was the definition of immortality. But how does a titan that held 90% of the market, survived 2 world wars, and built the world's tallest skyscraper simply vanish? How did an empire that owned the soul of the American home end up as a ghost brand name printed on boxes in Shenzhen, sold by a private equity firm that knows more about basketball than bobbins? Today, we are performing a financial post-mortem on the most dramatic collapse in industrial history. This is a story of staggering arrogance, a fever dream of aerospace gambles, and the lethal cost of forgetting what made you great in the first place. This is the rise and fall of the Singer Empire. The scorched bricks of Elizabethport tell the story of a tragic ending. But to understand how this titan fell, we have to look back at the unlikely, chaotic spark that started it all. Long before the global monopolies and the billion-dollar legacy, there was no empire. There was only a man running from his own failures. How did a bankrupt, runaway actor with a trail of abandoned families build a dynasty that outlasted kings? The answer isn't found in the machines he built, but in the hunger he carried, a desperate, ruthless ambition born from a childhood that left him with nothing but a name. To see the future of the empire, we must first step into the dirt and the drama of the man who created it. Chapter 1. The Visionary. Outcast, Ambition Amidst Chaos. Isaac Merritt Singer was born in 1811 in Pittstown, New York, into the type of stark, grinding poverty that leaves permanent scars. His father was a German Jewish mechanic, his mother a Quaker. When Isaac was just 10, his fragile home life shattered. His parents divorced, and his mother simply vanished. 2 years later, unable to tolerate his stepmother, 12-year-old Isaac bolted. He was a runaway, alone, penniless, driven by little more than raw ambition and a fiery, misplaced rage. His true burning desire was not for mechanics or factory work, but for the grand theatrical stage. He yearned to be a Shakespearean actor, seeking the applause, the drama, and the escape that performance offered. For nearly 20 years, he relentlessly pursued this impractical dream, founding his own touring ensemble, the Merritt Players. He chased the spotlight until he hit his late 30s, only to face the crushing reality that dreams rarely pay the bills. The theater troupe ultimately collapsed. Singer was deeply indebted, completely broke, and, in a breathtaking display of personal recklessness, had already fathered numerous children with multiple women whom he had zero capacity to support. By 1839, desperate for capital, he briefly pivoted to invention, designing a rock drilling machine. It generated no buyers, no cash, and no lasting impact. His personal life, however, was a relentless melodrama. At 19, Singer married Catherine Haley, who was a mere 15 years old. This teenage partnership with an itinerant, bankrupt dreamer was predictably volatile. Isaac soon abandoned Catherine and their children to chase his acting circuit. While touring, he began a simultaneous relationship with Mary Ann Sponsler in Baltimore. He then proceeded to leave both of them to take up with Mary McGonigal, with whom he fathered 5 more children. By the 1850s, Singer was actively maintaining 3 separate families across multiple cities, operating with zero financial or emotional accountability. Here is where the story shifts entirely. In 1850, Isaac Singer, then 38, was scraping by as a machine repairman in a greasy, low-rent Boston workshop. One day, a patron brought in a broken Lero and Blodgett sewing machine. Singer studied the busted, clunky mechanism. Where others saw a simple repair job, Singer spotted a profound, fatal flaw in the existing industrial design. He didn't just see a fixable contraption, he envisioned a complete revolution. Most men would have collected their fee and moved on. Singer, driven by a stubborn, desperate ambition, decided on the spot to rip apart and rebuild the entire concept from scratch. That single decision, that moment of intense focus in a grime-caked repair shop, was the true genesis of an empire. The failed actor was about to become an industrial legend. But Isaac Singer's greatest talent wasn't acting, it was hustle. He took a broken invention, fixed the mechanics, and then applied a ruthless marketing strategy that ignored every rule in the book. In the world of high-stakes innovation, a patent is a shield, but it's also a target. Singer had the gold, but he was about to learn that in 19th century America, victory is decided in the courtroom, not the workshop. Chapter 2. 8294. The blueprint that rewrote industry. Singer barricaded himself inside the Boston workshop, working with the manic intensity of a man who knew he was running out of second chances. For 11 consecutive days, he operated in a fugue state, subsisting on minimal food and sleep, obsessed with solving the engineering puzzle that had defeated every inventor before him. Then, he cracked the code. The resulting breakthrough was deceptively simple but devastating in its technical impact. A straight, rigid vertical needle mechanism paired with a horizontal work table. Previous designs featured curved needles and awkward fighting motions that snagged and fought against the fabric. Singer's vertical setup worked with the material. Crucially, he added a foot pedal, a treadle. This seemingly minor addition was utterly revolutionary. It freed up both of the operator's hands to expertly guide the fabric, granting unprecedented control and allowing for continuous, unbroken sewing. The resulting increase in productivity was shocking. Hand sewing, the labor standard for millennia, yielded perhaps 40 stitches per minute, requiring hours hunched over until the back ached and fingers bled. Singer's machine achieved an effortless 900 stitches per minute. This wasn't just an improvement. It was a quantum leap into a different universe of speed and consistency. For the first time, a machine could handle curves, complex patterns, and continuous seams without jamming. On August 12, 1851, Singer secured patent number 8294. He had his golden ticket, but golden tickets invariably attract vultures. But in the gold rush of 19th century innovation, a patent was more than a legal shield, it was a target. Singer had the gold, but he was about to learn that victory would be decided in the courtroom, not the workshop. Enter Elias Howe. Howe had patented his own earlier, less efficient sewing machine design years prior. Howe took one look at Singer's exponentially superior device and saw massive profits being stolen directly from his pocket. In 1852, Howe sued Singer for patent infringement. The legal clash dragged on for 2 brutal, financially crippling years. In 1854, the court sided definitively with Howe. Singer lost the war. He was ordered to pay Elias Howe $15,000 up front, plus a royalty of $25 for every single machine he sold thereafter. That royalty fee, a crippling percentage of the machine's sale price, could have buried the fledgling Singer Manufacturing Company before it even began. Singer was bleeding cash, and the entire industry was at a standstill. It was time for a brutal truce that would redefine American capitalism forever. But instead of engaging in an endless legal fight, industrial pragmatism prevailed. In 1856, the major sewing machine manufacturers, including Singer, Howe, Grover, and Baker, and Wheeler and Wilson, met and created the Albany Agreement. This landmark accord established America's first ever patent pool. This wasn't just a handshake. It was the birth of the sewing machine combination, America's first ever patent pool. It was effectively a legal cartel. By bundling their patents, they didn't just stop suing each other. They created a monopoly that forced every other smaller manufacturer to pay a license fee of $15 per machine to this group. They turned a legal war into a cash printing machine. They agreed to share their key technologies and split the royalties among themselves. Singer's fee dropped instantly to a manageable $5 per machine. The crisis was averted, allowing the industry to move forward without bleeding cash and endless court battles. Singer faced a choice that defines the difference between a failed inventor and an industrial titan. Fight to the death, or collaborate to control. He chose the latter, and in doing so, he helped birth a financial monster. Isaac Singer may have provided the mechanical vision, but he did not build the empire. That credit belongs entirely to a reserved, brilliant lawyer named Edward Clark, who joined the company in 1854. Isaac Singer may have improved the machine, but it was Edward Clark who invented the modern consumer. In 1856, he launched a plan that would change the world's relationship with money forever. Breaking the $100 barrier. In the 1850s, a Singer cost over $100, thousands in today's money. At a time when the average family earned only a few $100s a year, the sewing machine was an impossible luxury for the very people who needed it most. Clark realized the problem wasn't the product, it was the price tag. The 19th century fintech Clark's solution was the hire purchase plan. For just $5 down and a few dollars a month, a family could take the machine home immediately. Singer wasn't just selling hardware anymore. They were selling financial access. They turned a one-time transaction into a recurring revenue stream, becoming the world's first true fintech company, over a century before the term even existed. Democratizing technology. Suddenly, the industrial cathedral was no longer the exclusive playground of the rich. Poor families could use the machine to increase their productivity, earning the money to pay for the machine with the machine itself. Singer taught the world a new habit, how to spend money they hadn't earned yet. The installment plan opened the door to the masses, but to stay on the throne, Clark needed to ensure that once a customer entered the Singer ecosystem, they could never leave, and neither could their old machines. Then came the final, ruthless innovation, the trade-in program. Singer would accept an old machine as partial payment for a new one. Sounds generous, right? Except Clark implemented a scorched earth policy. They did not resell the used machines. They systematically destroyed them. Why? To annihilate the used market entirely. If cheap, circulating second-hand machines existed, customers wouldn't need to purchase new Singers. They were taken off the streets, smashed to pieces, and recycled. This trade-in program had a darker, more calculated financial motive. This was strategic cannibalization. By systematically destroying used machines, Singer eliminated the secondary market, forcing consumers back into their ecosystem for new, high-margin products. They burned the past to guarantee their future cash flow, a move as brilliant as it was brutal. Ruthless, yet devastatingly effective. Look closely at this calculated brutality. Edward Clark didn't just compete, he manipulated the very laws of supply and demand. His trade, in strategy, was effectively a mechanical slaughterhouse. By systematically smashing old machines to pieces, he didn't just recycle iron, he annihilated the second-hand market. He would rather crush his own creations into dust than let them become cheap competition for a new sale. But destroying the past was only half the battle. By introducing the $5 installment plan, Clark invented the way the modern world spends money. He proved that you didn't need to be wealthy to own the future. You just had to commit to paying for it 1 month at a time. This was the birth of the addiction loop, a closed financial ecosystem where customers bought on credit, used the machine, traded it in for the latest model, and kept the payments flowing forever. Singer's rivals didn't die because their machines were inferior. They died because Clark changed the rules of the game. He transformed a simple purchase into a lifelong financial cage. The result? A staggering 90% market share in America. This wasn't just business. It was absolute, undisputed dominance. Clark's genius extended far beyond finance. He instituted a revolutionary marketing strategy. He marketed directly to women. Not to the head of the household, the husband, but to the person who would actually use the product. He placed ads in women's magazines, hired female demonstrators, and set up elegant showrooms where housewives could test the machines and visualize the immediate, life-changing difference in their domestic labor. This was a radical break from the 19th century sales orthodoxy, but Clark knew the reality. Women were the decision-makers for this necessary domestic tool. By 1860, less than a decade after the 11-day workshop frenzy, the Singer Manufacturing Company was the undisputed world leader in sewing machine production. By 1876, 2 million machines had been sold. The name Singer became metonymic with the act of sewing itself. Isaac Singer was the mechanical heart, the man who turned iron into a machine that sang. But Edward Clark was the cold, calculating brain who turned that machine into a financial empire. Isaac engineered the efficiency. Clark engineered the consumer addiction. Without Isaac, the modern sewing machine wouldn't exist. But without Clark, Singer would have remained just a nameless repair shop in Boston instead of the king of global industry. Together they had forged an unstoppable industrial force, and they were only just beginning. They had the machine, the money, and the customers. But their global ambition was now outgrowing the walls of a simple workshop. But as the orders flooded in from every corner of the globe, Singer and Clark realized that their workshop success had created a logistical nightmare. To dominate the world, they didn't just need a better business plan, they needed an industrial fortress. Chapter 3. Industrial Cathedral, the Elizabethport Fortress. By 1871, the Singer Manufacturing Company faced a quintessential good problem. Demand had exploded past their maximum production capacity. Edward Clark recognized that to retain market control, they had to scale up instantly. The company committed to constructing the largest single-product manufacturing facility the world had ever conceived. The location chosen was Elizabethport, New Jersey, a gritty industrial zone located strategically on the Arthur Kill Waterway. This was a calculated move. The Arthur Kill offered direct shipping access to the Atlantic Ocean, meaning finished machines could be loaded onto freighters and sailed straight to the massive markets of Europe, South America, and Asia. International export was built into the factory's physical layout from its inception. Furthermore, major railroad lines intersected the property, ensuring seamless delivery of raw materials inbound and rapid distribution of finished goods outbound by train. The final piece of the puzzle was labor. Elizabethport offered a vast, desperate pool of immigrant workers, newly arrived and willing to toil long hours for low wages. In 1871, Singer purchased 32 acres and broke ground. When the Elizabeth factory opened in 1872, it was hailed as an industrial cathedral, a massive, multi-story architectural beast of brick and iron stretching across the waterfront. Building the walls was only the beginning. Inside this brick monster, Singer aimed for absolute self-sufficiency, a factory that breathed on its own. They bypassed outside suppliers entirely, constructing their own foundry to cast metal and a forge to shape steel. Driven by massive coal-fired steam engines and illuminated by an internal gas system, the complex was more than a factory. It was an autonomous industrial heart that manufactured every constituent element of the machine from scratch. But steel and iron were only half the story. To truly understand the sheer scale of Singer's monopoly, you have to look west, to South Bend, Indiana. While Elizabethport was forging the machines, South Bend was building the thrones they sat on. Singer didn't just buy wood, they bought forests. They owned timberlands in Canada and South Carolina just to feed this one factory. By 1914, the South Bend plant was a leviathan in its own right, the largest sewing machine cabinet factory on Earth. We're talking about a facility that devoured 50 million feet of hardwood and 10 million feet of veneer every single year. Imagine 20 acres of lumber yards stacked high with walnut and oak, with 5 miles of private railway tracks snaking through the complex just to move the wood. This wasn't just manufacturing. It was total vertical integration. Singer didn't just want to sell you a machine, they wanted to own every atom of the product, from the mine to the forest to your living room. The sheer scale of consumption was staggering. The plant incinerated 450 tons of coal weekly just to keep the steam engines roaring. The lumberyard stockpiled millions of board feet of wood for the polished cabinets and shipping crates. To manage the internal flow, an internal railway network crisscrossed the sprawling complex. Picture a miniature industrial circulatory system. Small rail cars hauled iron castings from the foundry to the machine shop, moved finished components to the assembly floor, ensuring that production never stalled. The manufacturing process itself was a marvel of specialization, a forerunner to modern assembly line techniques. The factory was partitioned into distinct zones. The foundry poured molten iron into precise molds. The machine shop used advanced precision tools, lathes, drill presses, stamping equipment, to mill and finish those raw castings to exact fractional specifications. The assembly floor then became a hive of activity, where workers fitted thousands of parts together. Finally, the painting shop coated the machines in their iconic glossy black finishes, followed by the packing department, where each unit was meticulously crated with straw and wood shavings, prepared to survive a grueling ocean voyage or a bumpy continental rail trip. In the 1870s, Singer invested in the most cutting-edge machinery available. They demanded production consistency that hand tooling could never achieve. While Henry Ford would later claim the credit for the assembly line, Singer was already demonstrating in 1872 that complex, high-quality mechanical devices could be mass-produced on an industrial scale. This mechanical symphony didn't just produce sewing machines. It acted as a gravitational force that pulled entire populations into its orbit. When the factory roared to life, it irrevocably altered Elizabethport. The quiet waterfront town instantly transformed into an industrial hub. Thousands of workers flooded in, necessitating a boom in housing, retail shops, and services. The rhythmic, thunderous clang of metal against metal and the incessant roar of steam engines became the inescapable heartbeat of the entire municipality. For the next 110 years, that heartbeat never faltered. The Elizabeth, New Jersey factory was the physical embodiment of a global empire, a monument to industrial ambition that was about to enter its golden age. The fortress at Elizabethport was now operational, but Singer didn't build a giant just to exist. They built it to conquer. The era of market leadership was over. The era of global monopoly had begun. Chapter 4. Monopoly. The 90% market command. By the mid-1880s, the Elizabeth factory was operating at previously unimaginable efficiency, churning out between 6,000 and 7,000 sewing machines every single week. Not per month, but per week. At its maximum capacity leading up to World War II, the facility employed 5,000 workers daily. The factory complex expanded relentlessly, swelling from 32 acres to 113 acres, encompassing 48 buildings and 2.6 million square feet of manufacturing space, a veritable city within a city, running with machine-like precision. Even disaster failed to halt its momentum. In May 1890, a massive fire ripped through a section of the complex. Singer immediately rebuilt, faster and stronger than before, scarcely missing a beat in production schedules. By 1890, the company had manufactured 13 million sewing machines globally since its founding. This was not market leadership. This was market saturation. The fortress at Elizabethport was now operational, but Singer didn't build a giant just to exist. They built it to conquer. The era of market leadership was over. The era of global monopoly had begun. But Elizabeth was merely the American command center. Singer aimed for global dominion. In 1867, they opened their first European factory in Glasgow, Scotland. Recognizing its insufficiency, they replaced it with the audacious Clydebank facility, opening between 1882 and 1884. This factory was a true monster. 1 million square feet, employing 7,000 workers and peaking at 13,000 machines per week, making it the largest sewing machine plant on the planet. Across the Atlantic, the expansion was even more aggressive. The Clydebank factory in Scotland wasn't just a factory. It was a fortress commanded by a 200-foot clock tower. This wasn't just any clock. It had 4 faces, each weighing 5 tons, making it the largest 4-faced clock in the world at the time, larger even than Big Ben. Yet, in a twist of architectural fate, a piece of that glory survived. Before building the record-breaking tower, architect Ernest Flagg designed a smaller prototype, the Little Singer Building at 561 Broadway. It featured the same intricate wrought iron balconies and terracotta details. While the massive skyscraper was ruthlessly torn down to make way for a steel box, the Little Singer was quietly preserved. It still stands in Soho today, a ghostly, beautiful reminder of the masterpiece that was lost just a few blocks south. It took 4 men cranking for 15 minutes, twice a week, just to wind it. But Clydebank wasn't just about production records. It was about survival. During World War II, this factory became a prime target for the Luftwaffe. In March 1941, during the devastating Clydebank Blitz, Nazi bombers pounded the facility. They destroyed 390,000 square feet of production space and set the massive timber yards ablaze. Amidst the inferno, a Singer employee named Alexander Ballantyne led a home guard unit to fight the fires. He saved the factory from total destruction and was awarded the George Medal for his bravery. Singer was so grateful, they let him live in a company house rent-free for the rest of his life. It's a reminder that behind the corporate coldness, there were moments of immense individual heroism. Later, in 1902, Singer tapped the massive eastern market with a factory in Podolsk, Russia. But the empire needed more than just metal. It needed wood. While Elizabeth forged the iron, Singer built a massive facility in South Bend, Indiana, dedicated solely to cabinetry. This wasn't a workshop. It was a lumber empire covering 60 acres, consuming 50 million feet of hardwood and 10 million feet of veneer every year. It had its own 5-mile internal railway just to move the massive stockpiles of black walnut and oak needed to house the machines. This industrial might was underpinned by an unmatched global sales network. But let's be clear about the economics here. Singer didn't just build these foreign factories to be closer to customers. They built them to jump over trade barriers. By manufacturing inside Russia and Canada, Singer ingeniously bypassed the heavy import tariffs that crippled their competitors. It was a masterclass in what economists call tariff jumping, securing their dominance by playing the geopolitical game better than anyone else. Thousands of showrooms and dealerships sprang up on every continent, from New York to Nairobi, London to Lima. Customers could walk into a Singer store, watch a hypnotic demonstration, and walk out with a machine using the universally available installment plan. By the early 1900s, Singer was exporting more machines than it sold domestically. The world was their primary customer. In 1913, Singer achieved the seemingly impossible: 90% dominance of the American household market. But 90% market share is more than just a number. It is a financial fortress. In the language of modern finance, Singer had built a wide moat. They didn't just have customers, they owned the infrastructure of American domestic life. This wasn't competition. It was a total monopoly that allowed them to dictate prices and crush any emerging rival before they could even blink. Financial dominance was only half of the story. To stay on top, Singer had to move beyond the wallet and into the collective soul of the world. Think about that for a second. In 1913, Singer didn't just have customers, they had a monopoly. If you were sewing clothes in America, you were paying Isaac Singer. It was a cash flow machine that seemed invincible. Owning a Singer became a cultural prerequisite, a piece of inherited domestic infrastructure passed from mother to daughter. The brand was not just trusted, it was implicitly assumed. The famous red S logo, a bold letter S with a woman sewing inside it, became one of the most recognized symbols on Earth. It was plastered on billboards, printed on millions of oil bottles, and even painted onto the sides of mountains in South America. Decades before the Nike swoosh or the Golden Arches, the red S was the universal signpost of Western quality. The ultimate display of corporate swagger came in 1908 with the erection of the 47-story Singer Building in New York City. Standing 612 feet tall, it was momentarily the tallest building in the world, a towering monument to their unstoppable success and wealth. In 1908, the company manifested its ego in steel and stone, the Singer Building in Manhattan. At 612 feet, it wasn't just the tallest building in the world. It was a masterpiece of Beaux Arts architecture designed by Ernest Flagg. But this skyscraper holds a darker, sadder record. In the late 1960s, despite being an icon of the New York skyline, it was sold to U.S. Steel. And in a move that would be unthinkable today, they didn't renovate it. They erased it. When the wrecking balls swung in 1967, the Singer Building became the tallest structure ever peacefully demolished by its own owner, a record that stood until 2019. Its destruction was so heartbreaking that it helped spark the modern historic preservation movement in New York. Today, the site is just another glass office block, but for a brief moment, Singer literally looked down on the rest of the world. While Singer's towers looked down from the clouds, their machines were lifting an entire gender up from the floor. However, this architectural marvel had a fatal economic flaw. Flagg designed the tower to be slender and elegant, with floor plates of only about 4,200 square feet. In the modern era of open-plan offices, This was useless. When the building was eventually demolished in 1968, it set a tragic record. It became the tallest building ever to be peacefully demolished by its own owner, simply because the land underneath it was worth more than the history standing on top of it. By the 1920s, the company boasted 1,700 stores across the U.S. and an astonishing 4,300 internationally. Over 60,000 traveling salespeople aggressively walked the streets, knocking on doors, relentlessly arguing that a Singer machine was not a luxury, but an absolute necessity for modern life. Even into the 1950s, Singer maintained 3,500 dedicated stores in the U.S. alone, and still controlled 40% of the market share. Beyond the metrics of height and sales, Singer irrevocably transformed society. Before the sewing machine, a skilled woman spent 14 hours making a simple shirt by hand. With a Singer, that time dropped to barely an hour. Beyond the gears and needles, Singer was a social catalyst. The sewing machine was the great liberator of the 19th century. By cutting down backbreaking labor, it gave women the most precious currency of all: time. This machine didn't just stitch fabric. It stitched the first threads of female independence, education, and leisure into the fabric of society. Women who were once confined by backbreaking domestic labor suddenly found hours of time liberated for education, work, or leisure. The machine didn't just save time, it indirectly accelerated the emancipation of women from one of the most grueling forms of household toil. Its impact was so profound that it won over the unlikeliest of fans, Mahatma Gandhi. While he famously boycotted Western industrial machinery and spun his own cotton to protest British rule, Gandhi made one exception. He learned to use a Singer while in a British jail and called the sewing machine one of the few useful things ever invented. When the world's leading anti-colonialist endorses your American machine, you know you've won the culture war. It also gave birth to the modern ready-to-wear garment industry, democratizing fashion by making affordable, mass-produced clothing available to all classes. But the sewing machine didn't just transform the individual home, it forged the very identity of the towns that built it. In Elizabethport, the impact was immediate and visible. Between 1870 and 1900, the town's population quadrupled. Entire neighborhoods were rapidly built to house the massive influx of immigrant labor. Bars, shops, schools, and churches all sprang up to serve the populace whose lives revolved around the factory schedule. The factory didn't just employ the town, it was the town. For the people of New Jersey, the factory wasn't just a workplace, it was their identity. The rhythmic thunder of the steam engines was the pulse of Elizabethport. Generations of families grew up under the shadow of those red brick chimneys. When you worked for Singer, you weren't just an employee. You were part of an industrial brotherhood that built the American dream, one stitch at a time. This was the golden age, and it felt utterly permanent. The golden age of Singer was a triumph of American capitalism, but every empire has its ghost. To understand the true cost of those millions of machines, we must look behind the polished mahogany and into the soot-stained lungs of the workers who built them. Chapter 5. Under the Shadow. The human and toxic. Cost. Behind the gleaming cabinets and the polished showrooms, there lay a Singer that the advertisements never displayed. Inside those formidable factory walls, the reality for the workforce was merciless. Workers punched in for 10 to 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The wages were subsistence level, just enough to survive, while the work was brutally repetitive and dangerous. The factory floor was a cacophony of peril: deafening stamping presses, massive cutting machines, and air thick with abrasive metal dust that coated the lungs with every inhalation. There were no ergonomic designs, and safety protocols were virtually non-existent. You arrived, you worked, and you hoped to leave with all 10 fingers intact. Accidents were routine and devastating. Workers' hands were crushed in presses, sliced off by high-speed blades, or scalded by molten metal or superheated steam lines. There was no concept of workers' compensation or structured health care. If you were injured, you were on your own. If you could no longer work, another desperate soul took your spot the next morning. In the decades before the 1910s, conditions were even worse due to the widespread use of child labor. Children as young as 10 or 12 worked the same brutal hours as adults. Their small hands were perfectly sized for reaching into the tight, dangerous spaces between high-speed machinery. They were cheap, disposable, and everywhere. Singer's management actively maintained a climate of fear and control. The company ferociously fought against unionization, which was viewed as a direct threat to efficiency and profit margins. Supervisors were tyrants, monitoring every movement, break, and whispered conversation. Step out of line, and you were instantly replaced. This culture of exploitation didn't just happen by accident. It was a direct reflection of the man at the top. While his workers struggled for survival, Isaac Singer was weaving a personal life of staggering recklessness. In 1860, displaying staggering arrogance, Singer sued Catherine for divorce, leveling the astonishing charge of adultery against her. The audacity was almost comical, but karma, or coincidence, finally caught up to him in 1862 when two of his mistresses, Mary Ann Sponsler and Mary McGonigal, accidentally crossed paths on a busy New York City street. The inevitable ensuing public meltdown was front-page fodder. The newspapers had an absolute field day, splashing the sordid details across headlines like, "Scandal of the Sewing Machine King." His private degeneracy was not merely aired, it was hung out for the entire nation to view. Humiliated and socially exposed, Singer fled America in 1863, taking refuge in Europe with yet another woman, Isabella Baer, who was decades his junior. By the time he died in 1875 at his opulent estate in Devon, England, Isaac Singer had officially sired 24 children with 5 different mothers. Despite the staggering chaos and abandonment he inflicted, he reportedly loved all his children and ensured they were financially provided for in his complex will. Singer may have escaped his personal scandals by fleeing to Europe, but the empire he left behind was a powder keg ready to explode. But workers, unlike machines, possess breaking points. In 1911, the pressure finally erupted at the massive Clydebank factory in Scotland. The immediate spark was the firing of 12 women in the polishing department. Within days, 10,000 workers walked off the job in one of the largest strikes in Scottish history. The demand was simple: fair wages matching the constantly escalating production quotas that management kept piling on. The catalyst wasn't just the workload, it was the implementation of scientific management, or Taylorism. Management began timing workers' every motion, treating humans like programmable components to squeeze out efficiency without increasing pay. This dehumanizing efficiency is what finally broke the workforce's spirit. The strike became a defining moment of the Red Clydeside labor movement, a period where Scottish workers violently pushed back against industrial exploitation. Singer eventually settled, but the message was clear. The foundation of the empire rested on the backs of people tired of being crushed. Discrimination was institutionalized. Women performed the same grueling labor as men, sometimes harder. Yet their paychecks reflected a significantly lower wage simply because of their gender. Immigrant workers from Italy, Poland, Ireland, and across Eastern Europe were relegated to the dirtiest, lowest-paying tasks, treated as subhuman by foremen who wielded their authority with outright cruelty. There was no internal recourse. To complain meant summary dismissal. And then there was the environmental toxicity. The extraction of human dignity was only part of the price. The very earth beneath the factory was being sacrificed for the bottom line. For over a century, the Elizabeth factory treated the Arthur Kill and Newark Bay as its private waste dump, pouring heavy metals, machine oils, and noxious chemical runoff directly into the water, poisoning the ecosystem for generations. The foundry stacks constantly belched thick black smoke into the air, coating nearby residential neighborhoods in a layer of soot and coal ash. The air reeked of sulfur, and the constant deafening industrial roar rattled windows and made restful sleep impossible. The residents of Elizabethport didn't just work for Singer. They lived inside its shadow, breathing its pollution and drinking water tainted by its runoff. The company built an undeniable global empire, but it did so by relentlessly extracting every ounce of labor and dignity from its workers, giving the bare minimum in return. They generated billions while the people who actually turned the gears lived paycheck to paycheck in degrading, dangerous conditions. The sewing machine, the symbol of domestic progress in America's living rooms, came at a hidden cost that most customers never saw. For every family that benefited from the machine's efficiency, there were thousands of workers who sacrificed their health, safety, and human dignity to build it. This wasn't just industrial innovation. It was exploitation dressed up as progress. The Golden Age had a dark, festering side, and eventually the system would collapse under the weight of its own neglect and greed. As the empire's internal foundation began to rot from exploitation, an external storm was gathering that would offer Singer a dark, new path to profit. Chapter 6. The Arsenal of Death. Retooling for Conflict. Singer didn't just stumble into the war business, they mastered it. They transformed from the king of the parlor into the arsenal of death through 3 calculated moves. The profitable pivot. During World War I, Singer's involvement wasn't forced. It was an opportunistic choice. They saw that war was, quite literally, profitable as hell. Government contracts were lucrative and guaranteed. Almost overnight, the assembly lines that once polished delicate parts for grandmothers were retooled to churn out 75mm artillery shells and 45 caliber pistols. 1. The total ultimatum. By World War II, the choice was gone. In June 1942, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum: civilian production must end. Singer committed to a total war effort. The Elizabethport plant became a 24/7 fortress, with a massive workforce of 40,000 people producing nothing but instruments of destruction. 2. Precision as a weapon. The military chose Singer for one reason: absolute precision. The same engineering required to keep a needle moving at high speeds without snapping a thread was perfect for firearms. Singer produced the M1911A1 pistol and the M1 carbine with obsessive accuracy. But they went further. They built the most complex tech of the era, the Norden bomb sights and fire control computers for the B-29 Superfortress. They proved that sewing machine precision could be weaponized into lethal force. But among the millions of shells and bullets, Singer produced one item that has become a legend in its own right: the Singer M1911A1 pistol. The government ordered an educational run of just 500 guns. Singer built them with the same obsession for precision they applied to their sewing machines, so precise, in fact, that they couldn't make them fast enough for mass war production. Today, those 500 pistols are the holy grail for collectors. While a standard World War II pistol might cost a few $1,000s, a genuine Singer M1911A1 sold at auction in 2017 for a staggering $414,000. It is ironically the most valuable thing the company ever manufactured. But the factory's retooling didn't just change the products, it fundamentally redefined the people behind the machines. The glowing foundries, previously dedicated to casting the ornate, heavy iron bases for treadle machines, now melted metal to forge bullets and gun parts. What emerged was the ultimate industrial paradox. The same hands, the same machines, producing instruments of domestic creation and instruments of mass death. To meet the insatiable demands of government contracts, Singer initiated a hiring frenzy. Thousands of new workers flooded into the Elizabeth complex, expanding the factory's physical and operational footprint. Crucially, during this period, women entered the factory floor in significant numbers, moving beyond the traditional light work of polishing or inspection. They operated heavy machinery, ran lathes, managed foundries, and handled materials previously reserved exclusively for male workers. The war tore down gendered barriers that had been reinforced for generations. The conflict opened professional doors for these women, offering them skill, purpose, and an unprecedented paycheck, even if those doors were temporarily hinged, set to slam shut the moment the men returned home. For 4 years the factory hummed, not with domestic tranquility, but with the grim, powerful machinery of industrialized death. Singer made a fortune. Their reputation, built on empowering the homemaker, was now tied directly to the burgeoning military-industrial complex. The war had made Singer rich, but the peace that followed would prove much more expensive. When the armistice arrived in 1918, Singer attempted to flip the switch back. Artillery shells ceased rolling off the lines, replaced by the familiar profile of the Model 66. But the world had irrevocably changed. The global market was tighter, more competitive. European manufacturers, recovering from the rubble of war, were rebuilding with modern efficiency, and nimble new players were entering the game, eager to challenge the old giant. Singer still dominated, retaining vast market share, but the competition was breathing down its neck. The consistency that defined the golden age vanished. Production now fluctuated wildly, reacting to economic cycles and unpredictable consumer shifts. The Roaring Twenties offered a brief, deceptive stability. Then, the Great Depression struck in 1929, an economic catastrophe that crippled sales. Families fighting merely to survive were not prioritizing the purchase of a new sewing machine. The interwar years were a precarious tightrope walk. Some good years, some brutal ones. Singer had to fight harder than ever just to hold the line. Once again, women stepped into the void left by men deployed overseas. They proved their mettle, welding, assembling, inspecting, and operating complex machinery with skill that surpassed their male counterparts, decisively proving that capability was never tethered to gender. The factory became a powerful symbol of American industrial might, a fortress of production fueling the arsenal of democracy. Planes flew with Singer-fabricated components. Soldiers fired ammunition stamped in Elizabeth. The company that defined domestic life was now an inextricable arm of the global war machine. While the heart of the company in New Jersey was beating at an all-time high, its international limbs were being torn away by the very same conflict. The irony was cruel. Singer factories on opposite sides of the war were manufacturing weapons to destroy each other. The massive factory in Wittenberge, Germany, was seized and converted to produce armaments for the Nazis. But the end of the war brought no relief. When the Soviet army advanced, they didn't just capture the factory, they dismantled it. Every machine, every tool, every scrap of metal was stripped and shipped back to Russia as war reparations. Speaking of Russia, the Podolsk factory, once the crown jewel of the East, had been nationalized by the Soviets decades earlier. During the war, it wasn't making sewing machines. It was building heavy motorcycles for the Red Army and ammunition to fight the Germans. The global network Singer had spent a century building was being cannibalized by the very history it helped shape. But war's end. In July 1945, following the terrifying obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. The war was suddenly, violently over. Singer had to flip the switch for the third time in 30 years, and this final transition proved the rockiest yet. The lucrative, guaranteed government contracts vanished overnight. The workforce of 40,000 was brutally slashed. As millions of soldiers returned home, military production ceased, and the factory had to perform the excruciating years-long task of retooling back to sewing machines. It required immense time and capital to smooth the production lines, rebuild supplier relationships, and retrain workers whose primary skill had become fabricating bomb casings. By the late 1940s, Singer was back in the civilian market, but its output was a mere shadow of its pre-war output. The war years had been a massive, double-edged sword. On one hand, Singer had proven its versatility and reaped staggering profits. On the other, they had spent 3 critical years absent from their core consumer market, and the industry had not waited for them to return. Competitors had innovated, consumer tastes had shifted, and Singer, for all its wartime heroism, was about to face a peacetime reality that would prove far less forgiving. The internal dynamics of the company, the factory, and its workers had been fundamentally altered by conflict. Yet, the biggest battle, the fight for relevance and survival in the changed post-war economy, was still to come. Singer survived the global carnage of the 1940s only to find that the peace of the 1950s was a far more dangerous opponent. Chapter 7. Corporate Inertia. The Saturation Trap. After World War II concluded, Singer emerged into a consumer landscape utterly unrecognizable from the one it had so effortlessly dominated before 1940. The primary structural problem was one of success: market saturation. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, nearly every middle-class American household that desired a sewing machine already possessed one. And thanks to Singer's own obsessive adherence to quality, casting components from solid iron and building machines designed to last not years, but generations, these machines refused to break down and necessitate replacement. Here is a profound irony in Singer's obsession with quality. In today's world of planned obsolescence, a vintage Singer is a defiant relic. These machines were over-engineered, built from solid iron to outlive their owners. For the nostalgic viewer, a Singer isn't just a tool. It's a generational heirloom, a physical contract of quality that the modern fast fashion industry has long since abandoned. Before the collapse, Singer had one final stroke of genius, a machine that today is considered the holy grail by collectors, the Model 221, better known as the featherweight. Introduced during the Great Depression in 1933, it was an engineering marvel. While competitors were making heavy cast iron anchors, the featherweight was made of cast aluminum and weighed only 11 pounds. It was portable, precise, and practically indestructible. Even today, a vintage featherweight can sell for hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. It was the perfect machine. But paradoxically, its perfection became a problem. Singer built them too well. They didn't break. They didn't need replacing. And when you sell a product that lasts forever, eventually, you run out of customers. The golden goose, heavy and proud, had simply stopped laying eggs. While Singer's own durability was locking them out of the American home, new predators were preparing to kick the door down. Simultaneously, a new threat materialized. Agile modern manufacturers in post-war Japan and West Germany began flooding the American market with alternatives. These were not the inferior junk machines Singer executives might have hoped for. They were well-engineered, reliable, lightweight, and, crucially, cost significantly less than a Singer. For the first time in memory, consumers had genuine choices, and faced with the option to save substantial money without sacrificing quality, many chose the foreign import. Singer's response to this existential threat was devastating in its inertia. They had none. The corporate structure had grown sluggish, bloated, and dangerously complacent, trapped by the memory of its own past supremacy. While nimble competitors embraced innovation, introducing lightweight aluminum bodies, advanced electric features, and new streamlined designs, Singer continued to pump out the same heavy, basic machines they had manufactured since the early century. The flagship factory in Elizabeth, the heart of the empire, was running on equipment and production processes that were decades old. Technology was outdated, and efficiency lagged far behind global standards. Instead of facing the painful necessity of modernization and massive capital investment, management clung desperately to the past, convinced that the sheer power of the Singer name alone, a century of earned trust, would carry them through the turbulence. It was a fatal miscalculation. Internally, the company was a corporate disaster zone. Management had become a labyrinth of bureaucracy, disconnected from the factory floor and the shifting needs of the consumer. Decision-making slowed to a crawl, tangled in layers of corporate red tape. Research and development was chronically underfunded, innovation an embarrassing afterthought. The prevailing corporate attitude seemed to be a silent, arrogant mantra. "We're Singer. We've always been number one. Why should we change?" But while the boardroom stayed frozen in the past, the American woman was walking away from the sewing table altogether. How does a company with the tallest building in the world and a century of dominance vanish so quickly? The answer lies in the classic trap of corporate arrogance. They stopped innovating because they thought they were too big to fail. Meanwhile, production costs continued their inevitable climb. American labor was demanding and receiving justified, but expensive, wage increases, benefits, and improved conditions. And the massive, aging Elizabeth factory complex required constant, prohibitively costly maintenance, simply to keep the rust from seizing the gears. Singer was operating on razor-thin margins in a market that was swiftly slipping through its fingers. Then the cultural upheaval of the 1960s struck, fundamentally shifting the ground beneath the company's feet. The women's liberation movement gathered momentum, bringing with it a deep reevaluation of women's roles. Fewer women were opting to remain full-time homemakers. Fewer still were interested in spending countless hours meticulously sewing clothes when mass-produced garments were readily available and inexpensive at department stores. The rise of fast fashion meant a consumer could walk into a store and buy a completed dress for less than the combined cost of the fabric, thread, and the precious time required to sew it oneself. Sewing transitioned from being a fundamental domestic necessity, a critical money-saving skill, to being a mere hobby, and not a particularly fashionable one among the younger, culturally dominant generation. Teenagers in the 1960s and 70s weren't learning to operate the family treadle. They were buying bell-bottoms and miniskirts off the rack. The core demand for home sewing machines collapsed. Singer panicked, and panic led to catastrophic decisions. In the mid-1960s, management decided the solution was not to fix their core business, but to diversify, to spread the risk by becoming a sprawling conglomerate. They acquired Fridden, a major manufacturer of calculators and typewriters. They poured staggering amounts of capital into unrelated ventures like aerospace and defense electronics. And we're not just talking about minor investments. Singer acquired Link Flight Simulation, the company that invented the pilot trainer. Suddenly, the same company that made your grandmother's treadle was building the simulators used to train NASA astronauts for the Apollo missions and military fighter pilots. It was impressive engineering, sure, but it begged the question, what exactly does a sewing machine company know about landing on the moon? This lack of focus eventually poisoned the products that still carried the Singer name. Singer didn't just decide to build missile guidance systems one day. They were driven into it by a perfect storm of cultural and psychological panic. 1. The cultural panic. By the 1960s, Singer's traditional foundation evaporated. The women's liberation movement changed everything. Sewing was no longer a survival skill or a good wife's duty. It was becoming a fading hobby. Simultaneously, fast fashion arrived. It was suddenly cheaper to buy a trendy miniskirt at a department store than to spend hours making one. Singer realized that if they stayed with needles and thread, they would drown in the 19th century. 2. The diversification delusion. Under CEO Donald P. Kircher, Singer fell into the conglomerate trap. The prevailing wisdom of the era was to spread risk. They acquired Fridden in 1965 and General Precision Equipment in 1968. They tried to be everything to everyone, but in reality, they suffered from corporate schizophrenia, losing their mastery of the one thing they did best. 3. High-tech envy. Singer was desperate to trade its old-fashioned mechanical image for the glamour of the space age. By acquiring Link Flight Simulation, the company that made sewing machines for grandmothers was suddenly building training modules for NASA astronauts. It was a leap into a world where they had zero core competency. They were trying to out-tech giants in industries where they were effectively blind. 4. The bank for bad ideas. The most brutal reason was financial. Management saw the sewing division as a cash cow, a source of easy money to fund their gambles. Instead of modernizing their aging factories to fight rising Japanese rivals, they drained the profits to subsidize the mounting losses of their aerospace fantasies. They starved their heart to feed a dream that would eventually kill them. Singer didn't venture into aerospace because they saw the future. They did it because they were terrified of the past. They traded their brand soul for shiny objects they didn't understand, and in the process, they guaranteed their own destruction. To understand why this expansion led to a total collapse, we have to look at the 3 fatal strategic errors that turned a world leader into a cautionary tale. 1. Corporate schizophrenia. By the mid-1960s, Singer's leadership succumbed to corporate overstretch. Terrified by slowing sewing machine sales, they acquired companies like Fridden and General Precision. But here was the problem. Singer had exactly zero expertise in high-tech defense or aerospace. They were a sewing machine company trying to outmaneuver tech giants in industries where they were effectively blind. By trying to be everything to everyone, they ceased to be great at anything. 2. Starving the cash cow. Singer's most lethal financial sin was how they treated their heritage. The sewing machine division was the empire's golden goose. It provided the steady cash flow that kept the lights on. But instead of reinvesting that profit into R&D to fight off rising Japanese competitors, management used it as a bank for bad ideas. They drained the lifeblood of their core business to fund the mounting losses of their aerospace fantasies. They didn't just neglect their heart, they bled it dry. 3. The ultimate corporate sin. In 1986, Singer committed what historians call the ultimate corporate sin. They spun off the sewing machine division entirely to focus on defense. They discarded 130 years of trust like industrial scrap. But as it turns out, you cannot use the generational loyalty of housewives to sell missile guidance systems. By abandoning the needle, Singer severed its only connection to the public soul. 4. Enter the raider. This weakened state made Singer the perfect prey for Wall Street. In 1987, notorious corporate raider Paul Bilzerian launched a hostile takeover. Bilzerian didn't want to save Singer, he wanted to butcher it. He dismantled the company piece by piece, selling off the Aerospace and sewing divisions separately to pay off the debts of the takeover itself. The Aerospace gamble didn't save Singer, it executed it. They sacrificed their heart to feed a head that didn't know how to run the body. Singer didn't collapse because they ran out of money, they collapsed because they forgot who they were. By 1966, Singer boasted $1 billion in revenue. By 1969, they had doubled that figure to $2 billion, employing 100,000 people worldwide. On paper, this looked like explosive corporate growth, but closer inspection revealed deep structural cracks. Only about a third of that soaring revenue came from the legacy sewing machine business. The bulk came from the new, unrelated ventures, industries in which Singer possessed absolutely zero deep expertise. They were attempting to be everything to everyone, and in doing so, they stopped being genuinely good at anything. Here lay the profound, cruel irony. The sewing machine division, though shrinking, remained the most consistently profitable part of the entire global enterprise. Yet, instead of reinvesting in this core strength, innovating, modernizing the Elizabeth plant, and aggressively fighting for market share, Singer treated it merely as a cash cow, a reliable source of funding for their reckless aerospace fantasies. The core sewing machine division was starved and neglected. Competitors like Pfaff, Bernina, Necki, and Brother smelled blood in the water. Singer tried to fight back with a Hail Mary pass. In 1975, they launched the Athena 2000, the world's first electronic sewing machine. On paper, it was a revolution, using a computer chip to control stitch patterns. But in reality, it was a reputation killer. The early electronics were expensive and couldn't handle the machine's vibration, leading to constant breakdowns. It proved that Singer hadn't just lost their market share, they had lost their touch. They introduced groundbreaking features, built-in zigzag stitching, computerized controls, sleek, compact designs. They marketed aggressively, listening closely to the evolving demands of the new generation of sewers. Singer, meanwhile, was paralyzed in boardroom debates about defense contracts and satellite navigation systems. The decline was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow, agonizing hemorrhage. Every year, market share slipped another fraction. Every year, the factories in Elizabeth and around the world produced fewer machines. The devastation wasn't limited to the U.S. In Germany, the massive Wittenberg factory suffered a fate even worse than closure. After World War II, the Soviet army didn't just occupy the plant, they dismantled it. As part of war reparations, the Soviets stripped the factory bare, shipping the machinery back to Russia and leaving Singer with nothing but an empty shell, a total loss of millions in assets. The company that once commanded 90% of the American market was now just another player in a crowded field, and, arguably, no longer even the best. The diversification strategy, intended as a lifeline, was actively killing them, draining resources, attention, and capital away from the very foundation that had built the empire. How does an empire this size bleed out? It's the classic tragedy of corporate inertia. Singer fell victim to the incumbent's dilemma. They were so blinded by a century of dominance that they treated their core business as a cash cow to fund failing ventures in aerospace. They stopped being an innovator and became a bank for bad ideas, proving that no moat is deep enough to protect a company that refuses to evolve. By the mid-1970s, the writing was scorched on the wall. The golden age was definitively over, and the final, brutal descent was about to begin. The cracks in the foundation were invisible to the public, but by 1975, the weight of a decade of bad decisions finally brought the structure crashing down. Chapter 8. The Aerospace Gamble. A Ghost in the Machine. In 1975, the unthinkable happened. The Singer Manufacturing Company, an institution synonymous with American industrial dominance and financial solidity for over a century, posted a significant financial loss. This was not a small dip or a quarterly adjustment. It was a profound, tangible deficit that sent shockwaves through Wall Street and the entire global industrial community. For a company that had previously seemed utterly invincible, the loss was catastrophic. The stock price immediately tanked. Investors fled in droves. Corporate confidence evaporated overnight. Management, finally forced to confront the impossible reality, began the series of brutal, deep cuts they should have implemented a decade earlier. Factories across the United States and the world began shutting down permanently. Tens of thousands of workers received pink slips. Plants that had roared with activity for decades went silent, their complex machinery left to gather dust. The empire was visibly, rapidly crumbling. The Elizabeth factory, the majestic crown jewel that had begun it all back in 1872, was bleeding out faster than anywhere else. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, civilian production had collapsed into insignificance. The massive complex that once employed 5,000 highly skilled workers and manufactured thousands of machines every week was a hollow shell. They tried to pivot one last time, shifting focus primarily to high-margin industrial sewing machines, the heavy-duty equipment used in garment factories, but even that niche market was swiftly moving overseas to cheaper Asian manufacturers. The workforce shrank below 1,000 employees. Entire buildings sat dark and empty, machinery rusting in place, windows broken. Walking through the Elizabeth factory in those final, desperate years must have felt like touring a mausoleum. The atmosphere was thick with the ghosts of better days, the imagined clang of hammers, the hiss of steam power, the phantom voices of generations of workers. Now there was only silence and decay. In February 1982, the inevitable, yet still stunning announcement came down. Singer was permanently closing the Elizabeth factory after 110 years of continuous operation. The heart of the empire was being ripped out. The remaining workers, the mechanics, the machinists, the assemblers, many of whom had given decades to the company and whose fathers and grandfathers had walked those same floors, were devastated. This was not merely a job loss. It was the abrupt, violent termination of a multi-generational legacy and the death of a community's core identity. On December 1, 1982, the factory doors closed for the very last time. A century and a decade of history was gone. Thousands of people lost their livelihood, not just within the sprawling plant, but throughout the entire ecosystem that had thrived around it. The suppliers, the local trucking companies, the lunch counters and taverns where paychecks were spent. Elizabethport, the working-class town that had quadrupled in size because of Singer, was gutted. Unemployment skyrocketed. Property values collapsed. Families who had built their entire lives around a steady factory wage suddenly had nothing. The social fabric of the community unraveled with frightening speed. Crime increased. Drug use spiked, filling the void left by lost purpose and income. The vibrant working-class district turned into a struggling, hollowed-out shell. Storefronts shuttered. Houses fell into disrepair. The town that Singer built was left to rot alongside the factory itself. And Singer. They didn't stick around to soften the blow. There were no major severance packages, no significant retraining programs, and no official acknowledgement of the century-long symbiotic relationship between the company and the community it had created. They simply packed up their corporate headquarters and left. But the death of a town was only a byproduct of a much deeper corporate betrayal, the systematic abandonment of the very product that built the brand. But the decay wasn't limited to American soil. In Canada, the fall of the empire took a much darker, more criminal turn. While Singer's exit from the U.S. was cold and corporate, its departure from Canada felt like a midnight heist. In 1986, the massive facility in St. John's, Quebec, a place so vast it had its own fire department and newspaper, simply locked its doors. But they didn't just leave. They were accused of the ultimate betrayal, disappearing with the employees' pension funds. Waiting to die, what followed was a legal nightmare that lasted 20 years. For 2 decades, elderly workers who had given their lives to the industrial cathedral fought in court for the money they had earned. By the time justice was finally served in 2006, the tragedy was complete. Most of the retirees had already passed away. They died waiting for the company they built to pay them back. The erasure. This is why, in St. John's, you won't find any monuments to Singer. There are no plaques of honor, no statues of Isaac Singer. The community felt robbed, not just of their jobs, but of their dignity. The betrayal was so deep that the town chose to erase the brand from its memory entirely. In 2007, the factory was leveled to the ground to make way for condos. In America, Singer died of arrogance, but in Canada, it died of malice. When management vanished with the pension funds, they didn't just steal money, they stole the final years of thousands of loyal souls. By the time the courts gave the order to pay, the workers were already in their graves. But the story holds one final, bitter betrayal. In 1986, 4 years after the Elizabeth closure, Singer management made a decision that laid bare their true priorities. They spun off the sewing machine division entirely, divorcing it from the parent corporation. The corporate entity that still carried the official Singer name was now fully focused on its ill-fated bet on aerospace and defense electronics. In 1986, the company committed the ultimate corporate sin. When Singer abandoned its core competency to chase aerospace fantasies, they lost their brand soul. You can't leverage a century of trust in sewing to sell flight simulators. This is a haunting lesson in corporate overstretch. When a giant forgets what made it a giant in the first place, it begins to rot from within. Once the soul was gone, the carcass was left for the scavengers. The sewing machine business, the very core engine that Isaac Singer and Edward Clark had created, was tossed aside like unwanted garbage. It was handed off, sold, and traded between corporate entities like a commodity nobody truly wanted to own. The executioner had a name: Paul Bilzerian. In 1987, this notorious corporate raider launched a hostile takeover of Singer. He didn't want to save the company. He wanted to strip it for parts. Like a chop shop mechanic, Bilzerian systematically dismantled the 130-year-old empire, selling off the aerospace division and the marine division to pay his own debts. He gutted the company so thoroughly that he was later convicted of securities fraud and served time in prison. But for Singer, the justice came too late. The damage was done. This wasn't just a decline, it was a financial execution. To understand the fall, we have to look at the receipts of ruin. 1. The 1975 deficit shock. For over a century, Singer was the gold standard of stability. But in 1975, the impossible happened. Singer announced a massive, historic financial loss. It was a psychological earthquake. Wall Street realized the gamble into aerospace and office equipment was a total failure. The invincible empire had started to bleed. 2. The mountain of debt. To fund these high-tech fantasies, management ran up astronomical debts. They transformed the sewing machine division, their only profitable asset, into a bank for bad ideas. They drained the cash cow to pay interest on loans for companies they didn't know how to run, leaving their core business defenseless against Japanese rivals. 3. The Bilzerian liquidation. By 1987, the empire was so weakened it became prey. Corporate raider Paul Bilzerian launched a hostile takeover, but he didn't come to build, he came to butcher. To recover his investment, he tore the Titan apart piece by piece. The Kierfot Guidance Division was sold off to Astronautics Corp. The Electronic Systems branch was stripped and sold to Plessey. The legendary Link flight simulation, the pride of their aerospace gamble, was sold to CAE of Canada. And finally, in 1989, the soul of the company, the sewing machine division, was sold off to Semitech Microelectronics. Aerospace didn't give Singer wings. It was the anchor that dragged them to the bottom. They burned a century of sewing machine profits on missile guidance systems, only to see the entire empire sold for scrap to pay off the debt of their own ambition. And it only got worse. The division changed hands multiple times over the next decade, each new owner attempting to squeeze out the last drops of residual value. By 1999, the inevitable climax arrived. The sewing machine company filed for bankruptcy 148 years after Isaac Singer patented his first machine. Bankruptcy. The word that no one in the 19th or 20th century could have ever associated with the titan that was Singer. The diversification gamble that management had so arrogantly embraced in the 1960s had failed spectacularly. They had successfully killed the golden goose and replaced it with absolutely nothing of enduring value. The Elizabeth factory, once the world's largest single-product manufacturing facility, sat abandoned and increasingly toxic. The town of Elizabethport struggled desperately to reinvent itself without the anchor employer that had defined it for over a century. And the Singer name, once worth billions and instantly recognizable globally, became the ultimate cautionary tale taught in business schools. A perfect case study of how even the mightiest industrial giants can fall when they lose sight of the core competency that made them great in the first place. The collapse wasn't just corporate. It was a profound cultural, communal, and total disintegration. An empire built over 100 years had disintegrated in less than 2 decades, leaving behind only ruins and regret. The bankruptcy papers in 1999 signaled the official end of the empire. But for the people of New Jersey, the real liquidation had begun decades earlier in the very soil they stood on. Chapter 9. Superfund Ruins. What the empire left behind. When Singer closed the Elizabeth factory in 1982, they didn't just leave behind massive empty buildings and tens of thousands of unemployed workers. They left behind an environmental disaster that had been brewing silently and relentlessly for over a century. From 1872 to 1982, 110 years, the factory operated with virtually zero environmental regulation or oversight. For the majority of that time, no one in industry or government cared what happened to industrial waste. So, Singer did exactly what every factory of that era did. They dumped it. Heavy metals like lead and cadmium from the foundry operations. Tons of oils, lubricants, and cutting fluids from the sprawling machine shops. And volatile chemical solvents from the painting and finishing departments. All of it flowed directly and unapologetically into the Arthur Kill waterway and into Newark Bay for decades. The toxic runoff poisoned the water, decimated fish populations, and contaminated the sediment beds. The damage was extensive and, in many areas, irreversible. But the pollution didn't stop at the water's edge. The soil across the entire 300-acre factory site was thoroughly saturated with petroleum products, industrial chemicals, and lead that had leached into the ground over generations. Every spill, every accidental leak, every careless disposal added another layer to the deepening contamination. The groundwater beneath the factory was a highly toxic cocktail, poisoned by runoff from the metalworking and foundry operations. It was completely unusable, and worse, it wasn't contained. The plume of contamination spread, slowly seeping into surrounding areas and threatening nearby residential neighborhoods. Before anyone could ever dream of redeveloping the land, it would require a massive billion-dollar cleanup. Decades later, substantial portions of that original site remained classified as hazardous. The poison in the water was mirrored by the rot in the structures themselves. After the 1982 closure, the huge factory complex sat inert, a decaying corpse no one wanted to deal with. Eventually, the property was subdivided and sold off in pieces. While some buildings were leased to small industrial operations, machine shops, light manufacturing, and warehousing, most of the sprawling complex remained tragically empty throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The abandoned buildings deteriorated rapidly. Roofs caved in under years of accumulated rain and snow. Windows shattered, leaving empty eyesores. Graffiti covered the once proud brick walls. Homeless residents and urban explorers quietly wandered through the ruins, picking through the remnants of a vanished industrial empire. Structural decay set in. Floors rotted, massive steel support beams rusted through. Eventually, some sections became so dangerously unstable that the city was forced to demolish them to prevent spontaneous collapse. Then, in January 2024, the old factory made headlines again, not for nostalgia, but for its final, dramatic self-immolation. A massive fire tore through part of the remaining complex. Over 100 firefighters from New Jersey and New York responded, battling flames that lit up the night sky. The intense heat caused 2 roofs to collapse, and a brick wall came crashing down, narrowly missing firefighters. It was a dangerous, chaotic mess, made worse by the sheer age and instability of the chemical-soaked structures. Miraculously, the very oldest, most historically significant section of the factory managed to survive the inferno, perhaps a testament to the stubbornness of old-world construction. But large portions of what remained were reduced to charred, smoking wreckage. Even today, some parts of the original Singer complex still cling to existence, used by small industrial tenants who require cheap, vast space and don't mind working in a rapidly decaying relic. But these structures are mere ghosts, faint echoes of the roaring, smoke-belching powerhouse that once utterly dominated the Elizabethport landscape. But the most devastating fire wasn't the one that burned the bricks. It was the one that consumed the livelihoods of thousands of families. The human impact on Elizabethport was immediate and catastrophic. When Singer departed, the town lost its largest employer by an astronomical margin. Unemployment exploded in the 1980s. Generations of families who had relied on steady paychecks suddenly faced destitution. Men and women who had dedicated their entire working lives to the factory were thrown into an economy that had no use for them. Their skills, machinists, metalworkers, complex assemblers, did not translate to the rising service economy. People left the state, packing up and chasing rumors of jobs in other fading industrial towns. Those who stayed struggled immensely. Elizabethport transitioned overnight from a thriving industrial center into a symbol of urban decay. The economic collapse triggered a massive cascade of social problems. Crime spiked and drug addiction became rampant, filling the enormous vacuum left by lost income and lost purpose. Storefronts that had been busy for decades shuttered. The main street, once bustling with workers grabbing lunch or stopping for a drink after their shift, turned into a row of empty, boarded-up buildings. Property values plummeted. Who would buy a home in a town with rising crime and zero job prospects? Families who had invested everything into their homes watched their hard-earned equity evaporate. The American dream that Singer had helped build, the stable job, the reliable income, the future for the children, died with the factory. The community was forced into a painful, decades-long process of complete reinvention. Slowly, agonizingly, Elizabethport diversified its economy, welcoming new businesses, though none could ever fully replace the economic gravitational pull that Singer had exerted. The town finally had to accept that the industrial era was over. Those jobs were never coming back. What Singer left behind was not just a contaminated industrial site. It was a community that was torn apart, an environment poisoned for generations, and a searing cautionary tale about what happens when massive corporations extract every ounce of value from a place and then abandon it without ever looking back. The buildings crumble, the soil is poisoned, and the people are left to pick up the pieces and attempt to rebuild from nothing. That is the true, toxic legacy. Singer left in Elizabethport. The empire in Elizabethport was reduced to ash and toxic soil, but in the sterile boardrooms of private equity, the Singer name was still a valuable asset to be traded. Chapter 10. The Empty Brand. From Manufacturing to Marketing. After the final bankruptcy of the core sewing machine business in 1999 and the subsequent restructuring in 2000, the Singer name became a corporate ping-pong ball, bounced aggressively between investors determined to extract whatever residual brand value remained. In 2004, the sewing machine division and the brand rights were sold to an American investment firm. 2 years later, in 2006, the brand landed in the hands of SVP Worldwide, a holding company that specialized in consolidating legacy sewing machine brands. The irony is almost poetic. For a century, German made Pfaff and Swedish made Husqvarna. Viking were Singer's mortal enemies, chipping away at its dominance. Today, they are all roommates. Under SVP Worldwide, these former rivals are now sister brands, manufactured in the same Asian factories, their distinct histories blended into a single corporate portfolio. The war for dominance didn't end with a winner, it ended with a merger. SVP Worldwide now controls 3 of the biggest, most storied names in the entire industry: Singer, Husqvarna Viking, and Pfaff. Today, the brand is part of SVP Worldwide, a holding company owned by private equity firms like Platinum Equity. They executed a classic corporate consolidation strategy, merging Singer with its former arch-rivals, Pfaff and Husqvarna Viking, under one roof. The fierce competition of the 20th century has ended not with a bang, but with a merger agreement. SVP Worldwide itself is owned by Platinum Equity, a colossal private equity firm with a sprawling portfolio spanning dozens of unrelated industries. The CEO of Platinum Equity is Tom Gores, a billionaire probably far better known for owning the Detroit Pistons NBA team than for his expertise in stitch patterns or treadle mechanics. This is the cold, hard reality of modern Singer. It is now a small, fractional piece of an immense global investment empire, run by people whose primary and sole interest is maximizing return on capital, not honoring the legacy of Isaac Singer or the thousands of workers who built the brand. It is business, pure and simple, stripped bare of any romantic notions of industrial heritage or community responsibility. This new corporate efficiency required a final, total divorce from the land where the brand was born. So, what does Singer actually do in this context? They still design, market, and sell sewing machines all over the world. The company focuses predominantly on the home sewing and crafting market, hobbyists, DIY enthusiasts, and new generations learning to sew for the first time. Their product lineup is vast, ranging from basic, durable mechanical machines that sell for under $100 to advanced computerized models featuring digital displays, automatic needle threading, and hundreds of pre-programmed stitch patterns. They produce everything a modern sewer might require: embroidery machines, quilting machines, and sergers. There is even a mobile app now that interfaces with certain Singer models, offering tutorials and design templates. It is a technological leap light years away from the heavy iron beasts of the 19th century, yet the iconic name is still there, proudly stamped on every product. Here is the final, inescapable kicker, the ultimate irony. Not a single Singer sewing machine is manufactured in the United States anymore. Not one. The factories are all located overseas: China, Vietnam, Thailand, and other regions where labor is inexpensive and the manufacturing infrastructure is geared for high-volume mass production. The machines are designed elsewhere, assembled abroad, shipped in massive containers across the Pacific Ocean, and distributed through a complex global network of retailers and online platforms. E-commerce has fundamentally redefined the business model. There is no need for a Singer showroom on Main Street anymore. You go to Amazon, click a button, and a machine shows up at your door 2 days later. It is maximally efficient, thoroughly modern, and completely and utterly disconnected from the American manufacturing roots that once defined the brand. But while the brand ghosted its home country, it found a vibrant second life in a parallel universe on the other side of the planet. In Sri Lanka, Singer isn't just a sewing machine brand, it is a retail and financial juggernaut. Serving nearly 30% of the entire population, their market penetration today rivals the brand's 1913 American Golden Age. But they didn't do it just by selling bobbins. They evolved. They launched their own bank, Singer Finance, and issued their own credit cards, proving that in the East, the brand conquered by becoming an ecosystem, while in the West, it simply withered into a memory. Why did they succeed where the Americans failed? Because they remembered the fintech DNA of Edward Clark. While the American executives abandoned their installment plan roots to chase aerospace fantasies, Singer Sri Lanka doubled down. They don't just sell sewing machines, they operate their own bank, Singer Finance, and even issue their own Visa credit cards. They realized that the real profit wasn't in the hardware, it was in the financial relationship with the consumer. This creates a striking East versus West paradox. In the West, Singer suffered from strategic schizophrenia. They took profits from sewing machines to fund flight simulators for NASA and aerospace weapons, sectors they knew nothing about. They became a bank for bad ideas, ignoring their loyal housewives to play war games. In the East, they chose organic diversification. They expanded into what their customers needed next: refrigerators, washing machines, and smartphones. If a family trusted Singer enough to buy a sewing machine on credit, they would return to buy a TV on credit. It was a logical, human-centric ecosystem. In the West, the brand withered and ghosted. In the East, it evolved and conquered. One side threw away its soul to chase high-tech dreams. The other kept the soul alive and turned it into an empire. In the East, Singer is a living ecosystem. In the West, it's just a label on a cardboard box. In terms of market standing, the Singer Manufacturing Company is no longer a titan, it is merely a combatant. They are locked in a relentless global competition, a vicious knife fight against modernized giants like Brother and Juki, and the high-end specialty manufacturers such as Bernina and Pfaff. Many of these rivals are foreign-owned, driven by lean Asian manufacturing models, and boast superior electronic integration. Singer's market share today is a tragic footnote compared to the Gilded Age when they commanded 90% of American households. While they remain a recognizable name, particularly in the critical entry-level and mid-range segments, their brand dominance has vanished, replaced by a battle for shelf space. The machine a beginner buys today often comes with a Singer badge not because it is technologically superior, but because the name still resonates. It is familiar, trustworthy, a phantom limb of reliable engineering rooted in collective memory. This is the strange paradox of modern Singer. The brand survives, but as a ghost. It is sustained entirely by calculated marketing and historical nostalgia, a cognitive dissonance that masks the reality of its current, often disposable quality. The company that once erected the tallest building in the world, employed 100,000 workers globally, and pioneered consumer credit with the installment plan, is now just another brand label. It is slapped onto anonymous products conceived in design centers thousands of miles away, and produced in factories its American consumer base will never see, by workers they will never meet. The Singer name still commands reverence among a specific demographic: the grandmothers who learned to sew on a rock-solid, cast-iron machine, and the baby boomers who remember their mothers using one. But for millennials and Gen Z, it is simply one option among hundreds in a crowded digital marketplace, carrying no more historical weight than any other inexpensive plastic commodity. The transition from industrial titan to digital commodity was complete, leaving behind a name that carries everything and nothing. At the same time, the globalization process is absolute. The transformation is complete. Singer went from being an American industrial empire, a foundational element of the nation's economic and domestic landscape, to a hyper-globalized entity owned by a multinational conglomerate. With manufacturing entirely outsourced to Asia, the company transitioned from being the undisputed leader of an essential industry to merely one of many players competing for marginal profits. The Elizabeth factory is gone. The American workers are gone. The physical empire is gone. Yet the name, the relic of that past, survives, printed on boxes shipped from Shenzhen. The true Singer, the one that built industrial might and reshaped how people lived, is dead and has been for decades. Today, the name Singer lives on, but it is a hollow echo of its former self. Singer today is a ghost brand. The logo survives through marketing and nostalgia, but the soul of American manufacturing is gone. It is a cautionary tale for the titans of today. A brand name can be bought and sold, but an empire is built on the sweat and grit of the people who believe in it. Once you lose that connection, you're just a label on a box. The rise of the ghost brand marks the final stage of Singer's decay, but the true value of this story isn't in its ending. It's in the warnings it leaves behind. Chapter 11. The Singer Post. Mortem. 4 Pillars of Failure. This is not merely a story about the rise and fall of a sewing machine company. It is a terrifyingly precise blueprint for how great empires crumble, and the lessons are painfully, achingly clear. Lesson 1. Innovate or die, the seduction of complacency. Singer dominated the global market for a century. They were considered untouchable, the immutable standard against which every competitor was judged. But dominance, in the absence of fear, breeds institutional complacency. While Japanese and European competitors were pouring capital into R&D, embracing lightweight materials, microprocessors, and computerized features, Singer continued to churn out variations of the same mechanically dependable, but technologically outdated basic machines. They suffered from the fatal assumption that their reputation alone would carry them into perpetuity. It did not. By the time the executive suite realized the world had moved on to electronic and computerized sewing, it was too late. Their competitors were not catching up. They were already orbiting ahead. Innovation is not a luxury or an optional line item. It is the fundamental mechanism of corporate survival. This includes not just the product itself, but manufacturing processes, supply chain efficiency, business models, and marketing adaptation. Stand still, and the world moves on without you, no matter how deep your roots. While the company was losing its identity in the skies, it was also losing touch with the people on the ground. Lesson 2. Don't abandon your core. The peril of corporate schizophrenia. In the 1960s and 70s, facing slowing core sales, Singer panicked. Instead of focusing resources on modernizing their sewing division, they embarked on a desperate, feverish spree of unrelated diversification. They plunged headlong into aerospace, defense electronics, industrial controls, and business machines, typewriters, calculators. On paper, this looked like smart risk mitigation. But the core problem was insurmountable. They possessed zero intrinsic expertise in these high-tech, highly competitive sectors. They were a sewing machine company attempting to outmaneuver titans in industries they fundamentally did not understand. Meanwhile, the sewing machine division, the engine that had built the entire empire and was still the most reliable source of profit, was starved of investment and neglected. Resources that should have revitalized factories and fought for market share were instead incinerated in ventures that invariably failed. Diversification only works when it builds upon existing core strengths. When you abandon what you are great at to chase fleeting trends, you risk losing everything. Singer chased shiny objects and forgot the source of its gold. Lesson 3. Listen to the market. The failure of adaptability. The 1960s and 70s ushered in revolutionary cultural shifts. Women were entering the professional workforce in unprecedented numbers, and the rise of the feminist movement challenged the traditional ideal of domesticity. Fewer women were staying home, and dramatically fewer were interested in spending hours on tedious garment construction when cheap, mass-produced, ready-to-wear fashion flooded department store shelves. The landscape of American domestic life was dissolving, and Singer's traditional customer base was evaporating with it. Instead of researching changing consumer behavior, pivoting aggressively toward highly profitable industrial sewing machinery, or finding new global markets, Singer stubbornly clung to the rapidly shrinking home sewing business model. They failed to acknowledge the cultural earthquake. Markets do not care about historical assumptions. They shift, they evolve, and if you are not constantly adjusting and listening to the seismic rumblings, they will leave you in the dust. Singer stopped listening, and that deafness proved fatal. Beyond the lost sales and failed products, the final measure of an empire's fall is the human wreckage it leaves in its wake. Lesson 4. Legacy isn't just about profit, the cost of exploitation. For 110 years, Singer provided stability, created jobs, and anchored communities like Elizabethport, New Jersey. That level of industrial contribution defines a powerful legacy. But a legacy is defined just as much by what you leave behind as what you build. When Singer shuttered the Elizabeth factory permanently in 1982, they executed a cold and immediate retreat. Thousands of workers were abandoned without adequate severance, retraining programs, or community support. The factory site itself was left behind as a toxic wasteland, a derelict industrial zone requiring eventual federal Superfund cleanup. The surrounding town swiftly collapsed into a cycle of poverty, crime, and urban decay. Singer extracted every possible ounce of labor and profit from Elizabethport for over a century, and then discarded the community like industrial trash. Successful corporations hold a profound responsibility that transcends quarterly earnings reports. They have a moral obligation to the people who built them, the communities that hosted them, and the environment they impacted. When profit is pursued without care for consequences, what remains is not a legacy, but calculated exploitation and ruin. Isaac Singer began as a broke, failed actor at 38, an unlikely candidate to build anything, much less a global empire. But he did. He forged a company that controlled 90% of its market, employed 100,000 people, and became a cultural institution. And then, in less than 2 decades, it all collapsed. Bankruptcy, corporate sales, factory demolitions, abandoned workers, and ruined communities. Here is the brutal, inescapable truth. No empire lasts forever. Not Singer's, not any nations, not any corporations. Today's overwhelming success is never a guarantee of tomorrow's survival. The world demands constant, uncomfortable adaptation. Innovation, strategic focus, market listening, and corporate responsibility. These are not mere buzzwords. They are the keys to sustained existence. Singer possessed every advantage in the world and still failed because they systematically ignored these immutable principles. The story of the Singer Manufacturing Company stands as a stark, powerful warning. Your past victories do not protect you from your current mistakes, but if there is a single silver lining, it is this: the lessons remain intact. The empty lots where the Elizabeth factory once stood serve as an enduring, scarred reminder of what happens when giants stop moving, stop listening, and ultimately stop caring. The ruins of the Elizabeth factory stand as a warning. In the world of business, your past victories are your greatest liabilities if you stop moving. Success is fragile. Empires fall. And the question for today's giants is, who's next?